Hey Tony, it's Tuesday, and first off, to answer your question of the week, I already let you know, but unfortunately, I'm not gonna be able to make it to the tournament on this weekend. But it should be fun. I'm hoping that some of my friends who are like my friend who's a tournament organizer will have a good time, but we'll see. So, what I want to talk about today is a video I've kind of been putting off now for a while, and I think so. On February 28th of 2025, there was a disastrous press conference between Donald Trump, Vice President J.D. Vance, and Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky. In that one, the United States, particularly through Trump and Vance, reversed 80 years of U.S. foreign policy and led to what I firmly believe the end of the American empire. Now, I'm not being like, that's being somewhat dramatic, but not hyperbolic. So, the American empire is one that's been, ongoing. I kind of spoke about this at an earlier date with like the Pax Americana. You can look at America and basically say they've been essentially an empire the way we understand it since 1776 when they declared independence, but more so in 1789 when we actually signed the Constitution and formed what is now the United States of America. And throughout that time, we have been certainly a regional power. I mean, we've been pretty much the most powerful nation for the most part in the Americas for most of our existence. You could argue British Canada, but even Canada, I think I would put America as the stronger empire from the way we expanded outward more so than Canada ever did. But on that date, on February 28th, with that press conference and that reversal of that foreign policy, the United States almost immediately became an island, for lack of a better term. Now, there are two different types of power as far as like a macro global scale, and that is soft power and hard power. Hard power is what you more think of like the displays of power, the military occupations, and things like that. Whereas soft power is not quite that. Soft power is more through trade deals, diplomacy, negotiations, and things like that to basically keep your strongest place in the world. And I think it's pretty universally agreed that from 1945 on, at the end of World War II, we entered into the American century. You could argue that the American century really started during the 1900s, the early 1900s, because even during World War I, America was still an economic global power, even if they weren't necessarily a global military power. But since 1945, the United States and the Soviet Union were the two global superpowers. And much of the American foreign policy from 1945 to the 1980s, when the Soviet Union fell, was the theory of containment. And basically what containment was containing communism where it formed to make sure it didn't spread. And communism was almost always pushed by Russia and their allies, such as China, such as other like Russian satellite states. And on that day with that press conference, the United States stood against Europe, stood against someone who's been, and by all intents and purposes, a war of extermination. Like, Russia is not just going to stop with certain Ukrainian territorial gains. They will want to keep spreading and spreading and spreading. So eventually Ukraine is just swallowed up by Russia. A lot of in the sense of like maybe not be called Ukrainian Russia, but in the same sense that like Belarus and Georgia are extensions of Russia. And on that date, when the United States stood against Ukraine and sided with Russia, that signaled to the world that the United States is not the superpower we were. We are no longer, in many ways, a global superpower because of many actions that Donald Trump has taken. So, namely, first off, much of what America's power was formulated on was the fact that we had allies in Europe, that we constantly spread intelligence to each other. We kept in the loop to basically like work for the most part together to kind of build the capitalistic state, which was formulated predominantly by NATO, North Atlantic Trade Organization, or Treaty Organization, sorry. And NATO was, pretty much it was the American branch of the Cold War, whereas the USSR had their own, I can't remember the name right now, but they had their own bloc that was basically caused as a direct competition to NATO. And we have now essentially disrupted all those allies. We can also look at the global economy right now, specifically the economy of America. So you might or might not know, but today Donald Trump put in the order for the tariffs that he ordered back in February that I kind of did my capitalism and economy video on. He put tariffs in place, and our stock market crashed today. Over the past month, the Dow Industrial Average is down about 5%, and the NASDAQ average is down about 6%. I have to double check that, but that was what I saw earlier today. It was essentially down 6% over that last month. Particularly over the last 24 hours, the Dow has dropped almost 2%, about 1.5%, and the NASDAQ has dropped about 2%. And it's because with the tariffs, it has started a trade war, and nobody really wins in a trade war. So we live in a globalized world right now. Globalized trade routes, globalized treaty organizations, globalized decisions within nation states. And what the United States has done now is alienate our closest allies. Canada has been America's closest ally for years and years and years. Since, I would argue, since World War I, Canada has been America's closest ally. And we've also alienated Mexico, who has also been traditionally an incredibly close ally, along with our allies in Europe. So in response to America completely bending the knee to Russia, the European Union is now all the countries in the European Union are starting to ramp up military spending, are starting to ramp up their economic spending, because America can no longer be relied upon. Which means in the span of a month and a half, Donald Trump has completely alienated all of our allies, has kowtowed to our traditional rivals, and has destroyed America's place in the world in a way that it will take years and years and years to come back. There's no other way around that. Already, a lot of our former allies are saying they will no longer trade state secrets with America, because there's a very high likelihood that they'll just go on to Russia, and Russia is, for all intents and purposes, one of the biggest enemies of Europe right now, one of the biggest rivals of the EU. China is kind of in their own weird situation. China is definitely one of the two or three strongest economies in the world, behind maybe America and I think probably the EU if you kind of combine that together. But China has been benefiting greatly from America dropping their place in the world, because now with all the trade wars that are ongoing, China is now engaging in trade with our former allies, and we are now stuck on an island. And this soft power empire that we've built over the last 80 years is gone in the span of a month and a half. Now our allies are not giving us information. Certainly our rivals such as China and Russia are hoping for America to collapse in on itself. And we are in a spot now that I don't see a good way forward. The only way forward is really like a complete rebirth of our government. I'm not going to say, revolution or anything like that, but we need to basically come to a point where we have to rebuild everything from the ground up. Our allies no longer trust us for a good reason. We have traded American state secrets and intelligence state secrets willy-nilly across the world, predominantly to Russia and Russia's allies. And we're now stuck in a situation in which there's not a good way forward. And our allies are not our allies anymore, and our rivals are still our rivals. America's basically put themselves on an island, a diplomatic, military, economic island, and it's not going to be for the better. Our economy is going to be in tatters, truly, over the next however long this trade war lasts. Because even the last trade war that took place during Trump's first administration had incredibly wide-reaching effects, particularly on American farmers, particularly soybean farmers. They have not recovered from that trade war almost, I think it was 6 years ago. And we're in a much larger trade war now, a much larger international embarrassment, and the world can no longer rely on America. So our soft power empire is now a thing of the past. We no longer have our position as a global superpower, because at this point we're pretty much only a regional power, because it's just because of our incredible military. But the world itself is turning their back on America for good reason. We are not trustworthy, and as a whole, we are collapsing in on ourselves. I didn't really want to make this video, but that press conference on the 28th really, to me, signaled the end of the American empire. And I really wanted to talk about that because it's something that we're going to be dealing with for years to come. I don't see an easy way forward. I don't see us regaining our global power status until we completely remove some of like the authoritarian, autocratic push that we're seeing, particularly amongst the far right and the evangelical movement. The fact that they've pretty much just destroyed all of our traditional allies. And now we're kind of in this world where I don't know what's going to happen. So Tony, my question for you is, what do you think? Do you think there's an easy way forward? Tony, I'll see you on Friday. Later, bro.